Hello and welcome to Catholic Saints. Today we are talking to Dr. Elizabeth Klein. Thank you for being here, Dr. Klein.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, and today we are talking about St. Patrick. He is a beloved saint of many people. What do we need to know about him?
Well, St. Patrick is a patristic saint, so he falls into my favorite time period, which is one reason I wanted to talk about him.
Tell us, what is the patristic period, please?
So the patristic, I mean, some people debate when it ends, but basically it's somewhere from like the year 200 to the year 600 or 700, depending on how you decide to break it down.
When someone says early church father, that's the area.
That's the period they're talking about.
St. Patrick, early church father.
He's an early church father.
Okay.
And there's a lot of sort of legendary material surrounding St. Patrick and lots of famous stories, but I thought it'd be really awesome to talk about kind of the historical Patrick and the material that St. Patrick left us, because St. Patrick actually left us a couple pieces of writing, and they're short, but they are very interesting. So he left two works that are kind of securely attributed to him. One is his confession, which is some kind of defense of himself. It seems that maybe he was accused of something, maybe by some other bishops. So it's partly autobiographical. And so that's where we get kind of really solid evidence of his life's work. And
Can I ask a question? Was there was it common back then to do something like this, like a confession? Because I'm thinking about St. Augustine's Confessions. Was this like a common practice per se?
No, it wasn't a common practice, I wouldn't say. Although the idea of writing a defense of yourself was a common practice.
Yep.
So the autobiographical nature of it isn't necessarily super common.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. And then there's also a short letter that he wrote to someone named Coroticus.
Great name.
Who we don't know who it is. Could have potentially been a king. Some people have tried to identify it with different figures, but whoever this person is raided one of the churches in St. Patrick's diocese and carried off and killed Christians, even though they themselves were Christian. So Patrick is, condemning this.
As one should. Okay. Did he, so he was a bishop. Was he a bishop when he wrote both of these things? Do you know? Do we know?
Yeah, so he wrote, so this is written late in his life. He says that in the confession that he's writing it as an old man.
Okay.
And he even apologizes that his Latin isn't amazing and that he didn't kind of dare put anything down before. So yeah, he's older, kind of at the end of his career when he's writing the confession.
And if someone wanted to look up how they could read this confession, is it available online if they wanted to find it?
That's a good question. I don't know if it's available free online, but you could look up the Confession of St. Patrick. And I know it's available very inexpensively because
Google it.
I bought it and read it.
Nice.
So, just some things about his life that he tells us from his confession is that he was born in Roman Britain. So this is kind of the southeast part of Britain, which was under Roman control at the time. And so Christianity had spread there early. I mean, basically Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire by the 3rd century, even to like the far places in the empire. So Christianity was there, but it was kind of still a minority, kind of weird thing from the East, considered by the people there. But Patrick tells us that his father was a deacon and his grandfather was a priest. So he's already kind of like
he's in a Christian family.
He's in a Christian family.
So Christianity in these parts is early. It's not totally everywhere else. What is it up against? Is this just various forms of paganism? Would that be the competing religions?
Right. So various forms of paganism. And in some of the later legendary lives of Patrick, you see him kind of like doing battle with the Druids and things. And it's very clear that especially in sort of Britain, Ireland, and Scotland, that like it was hard fought against paganism. It was deeply rooted. And so
stubborn sea people. Yes.
So really the people think about the conversion of England as happening through kind of more Irish missionaries later and also Augustine of Canterbury. But it was there earlier as Patrick kind of witnesses. But the fact that it wasn't super strong is also witnessed by Patrick because it seems he wasn't really practicing his faith in his early life, because he says even though his dad was a deacon and his grandfather was a priest, he was captured by pirates when he was 16 and said that he was like a great sinner and wasn't, turning to the Lord. It wasn't sort of active in his faith. But that experience of being sold into slavery made him really turn to the Lord and seek the Lord and had a kind of sincere conversion through that.
This is a comforting story for any parents out there who are faithful Catholics and their children are maybe wayward.
Maybe they'll get kidnapped by pirates.
They might. Pirates can be a grace. Yes.
I do think obviously we know this, that suffering can be a place where God can come in and that, having difficult experiences in life can be a very valuable thing. But it's a good thing to remember that
it
is that's true, and it's always been the case, and that the forms of suffering we experience are not as bad as in some periods of history.
Yeah, no kidding.
Patrick, he talks about being captured multiple times. This isn't the only time that he's captured, and then the fact that his letter talks about other Christians being captured, it seems like there was a lot of
there's a lot of capturing,
pillaging, and of course this is even before the Viking conquest with more capturing and pillaging.
So he's captured by the pirates. How old was he?
He's 16.
All right, he's young. Okay. So then what happens after the pirates?
So he, as a servant or slave, is a shepherd.
Okay.
And he spends most of his time with the sheep on the field, and he says he takes time for prayer. So he just really is out in this field praying kind of night and day and having this sort of sincere turning to the Lord.
Can I ask, though, when he was captured by the pirates, was he a faithful guy?
No.
Okay, so then he's captured by the pirates. So what happens, do we have any idea what happens between him getting captured and then being a shepherd and he's praying and he's becoming a more faithful person?
He doesn't really say anything too much. Yeah, he just says that that experience of kind of, this suffering, he just says, well, I deserve this because I'm a sinner. And that kind of causes him.
An awakening of conscience.
Yeah, an awakening of conscience. And then, he's kind of afforded this weird kind of retreat situation, almost away from everyone he knows, away from, you can think away from all of his friends, away from all of his possessions, away from anything that would tempt him to think of anything other than God.
It's so interesting. I feel like there's a diary of Eddie Hilsome. I don't know if you've heard of this. She was a Jewish woman that was captured during the Nazi occupation. But I've heard of this in other places too, that people who are captured and put into solitary confinement they're just captured, that they can often come to an awareness of their own sinfulness. And maybe even if they were unjustly captured or whatever, they come to this realization of no, I am a sinner and this is just not in that it was right that I'm being captured by this group of people for this reason, but it is just in that, yes, I have done harm. There's an awareness of sinfulness, which
that's really interesting. It's almost as if he turns to God to ask God why God is allowing this, and then finds out well, what do I really have to say to God?
Who says why not? Why someone else and not me? It's just it's a really interesting thing that I've never experienced.
Yeah, there's this kind of beautiful I don't know if he's intentionally recalling this, but it really reminded me of King David. When Samuel comes to find the king to anoint or whatever, David's not even there because he's the youngest and he's out in the field. David, of course, the reputation for praying the Psalms and being very contemplative. It just it's just a very beautiful picture that he kind of had this horrible experience, but that it also afforded him this complete freedom from all of his attachments and made him a very prayerful man.
And you can either go one of two directions in that. When terrible stuff happens to you, you either close in, get more angry, more bitter, more mad at God or other people, or you come to that realization that leads to in a very paradoxical way, more freedom, which is here what happened to Patrick.
Yeah,
so he's in the field.
Yeah, and then this leads to literal freedom because he's praying kind of night and day out in the field with the sheep, and he receives a vision from God that he will be able to escape his captivity and sort of the port he's supposed to go to. So Patrick escapes and finds a boat, and he doesn't really tell us exactly where he is or how the journey works, but he has a very treacherous, long journey back to his hometown, and part of his experience is of almost dying of starvation with kind of the sailors on the ship, and he prays to God for food, and they encounter a herd of swine, and he converts the sailors. So he has his first missionary experience on his journey home, and then he makes his way back home, but he really emphasizes then this divine call to go back to Ireland later in his life to preach the gospel.
Yeah, which is crazy.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we get a kind of the sense of his family story here. I mean, I think a lot of saint stories, we get only something like you have in the Gospels where Jesus says, come follow me, and then everyone drops everything and does what he says. But you do get a little bit more background of Patrick and the difficulty that it was for him to follow this call, because he has this vision or this dream where someone hands him a letter where the voice of Ireland is begging him to return. And his family's what are you talking about? You've been away from our family for 6 years.
You were captured. This wasn't.
Yeah, we haven't seen you, and you're gonna go back to a country where you're never gonna see us again. And his family's Christian, as far as we know. And so I think it's really interesting, even such an early figure, to get a little bit behind that kind of legendary heroic act. It is heroic, but it isn't like easy. It's not just like this very triumphant, yes, I will go and all the Irish will just fall down at my feet. It's clearly very difficult. And he talks about especially the difficulty of being a foreigner, going into Ireland and trying to preach to the people, and how difficult that was. But there's this kind of sense.
Yeah, and can I add?
Go ahead.
There's other. I'm thinking about St. Augustine of Canterbury, some of the other early fathers who go into pagan territory. Like evangelization back then was not what we would often think of it today, where it's like I'm trying to talk to someone in a relatively simple manner and explain the truths of the faith, and maybe have some like argument or something. That this was like a dangerous venture. There's not like It wasn't just conversation. So for him to make a decision like this to go evangelize these people, this is like, oh yeah, I could probably will die. Like
yeah, and I was just going to say, actually, right before that, this is perfect for what I was just going to say, is like, especially like Britain and Ireland are seen as like the edge of the known world, right? Beyond that is the sea. Yeah. They don't discover the new world for a long, long time. Yeah. So as far as anyone's concerned, it's like,
this is it.
That's it. That's like the edge of the world. And right, the edge of the world was always kind of considered like that's Satan's territory. Right? The farther you get from like the center, it's like
more chaos.
Yeah. The devil's out there out to get you. And a lot of these early saints, it's like they're really going into enemy territory, what they see as spiritual, like sort of enemy territory, to do this work. And he really emphasizes that this was a call from God and not from himself, possibly because he's defending himself. But I do also think there's a kind of a sense of like who would choose this for themselves?
No, I know. Who wouldn't just stay home?
Who after escaping slavery from these foreign people,
enough.
Would go back to try to make them Christian? Like what?
And it's inspiring.
Who would want to do this? So obviously, St. Patrick is credited as converting Ireland, and that he's called even. In the East, he's called equal to the apostles. Which,
interesting.
Yeah, so that title, equal to the apostles, is used for anybody who's said to like convert a whole people. So it's kind of the idea that like the apostles were sent out to the nations, and so they're like the apostles in bringing whole nations to Christ. And that might be like a bit of an overstatement because Pope Celestine had already sent around the same time a bishop named Palladius to Ireland to evangelize Ireland, but it doesn't seem like he was super successful. And so certainly like the crediting of the conversion of Irish Patrick is not made up. He says himself that he baptized himself thousands of people.
Yeah, wow.
And that's a lot of people at this time,
a lot of people.
Especially in a sparsely kind of populated place. And his later lives especially talk about his kind of work with women and the poor. And this is a really common theme in early Christian evangelization, is that often it seems that Christianity appealed to the downtrodden. And for that reason was often suspected, right? Like people who could kind of seen as charlatans who were like tricking the simpletons. But I think it's very beautiful because it always meant sort of the mission call was to often the poorest of the poor first and the lowest first, which seems just very fitting given sort of Christ's own mission, the people who Christ chose to call as his first disciples. And of course, kings and all that convert too, and they were important to missionize. But it does really seem like it was kind of always like a grassroots venture.
Like it's to the least of these,
Yeah, and it's often women who are widowed who kind of take up monastic vows early, and they become sort of people who act in charity to the poor. And also, if you think about, like, it always sounds noble to, like, go to the poor.
Yeah.
But, I mean, if you got to think about, like, what do the poor look like in, like, rural, early medieval Ireland? Like, this is not... really... This is not, like, these are people who are, like, squalid.
Yep. There's a... It's in the Brothers Karamazov. I don't exactly remember where, but there's a great line that is something along the lines of love in the abstract, or love as an ideal, is like a grand and beautiful thing, but love in the concrete is a harsh and dreadful thing. That like putting love into action, like loving the poor, it's actually like very messy, very difficult, very hard. And that's something that like all of us, when we run into that at all the time, it's like it's so easy to be like, oh, I'm going to go evangelize, I'm going to go love XYZ person or a group of people. And then you do it and you're like, oh, this like... You just realize all this stuff rises up and you're like, this isn't what I thought it was going to be.
Yeah. And especially when, Patrick's not a native. So trying to reach people who have different beliefs that are very at odds with what the Christian faith is trying to preach. And I mean, being up against, too, I mean, preaching the gospel in a land with so much suffering. I mean, ancient people, basically, it's like your God was your only, like, he was your doctor, he was your, like, financial aid. Like, if things were going bad, you had to, like, placate the correct gods to make it go right. So when you're preaching a very different gospel of, like, embracing suffering and that, you know, but God isn't just like a candy machine that you get all your blessings out of. That's very hard. It's very hard in a time when, like, plagues, you know, ravage the land, or you get stolen by pirates on your baptismal day, as in his letter.
And that's why the saints are so great, because they give us the witness that is credible, where it's like someone like St. Patrick could come to the Irish people and preach the gospel and say, this God is worthy of your praise and adoration. And when they're like, well, who are you to say? And it's like, oh, I've been captured, I've been hungry, I've been where you're at. And it gives a credible witness. And I feel like the saints are always, like, taking on the infirmities of the people that they're evangelizing, because that's where you gain credibility. And I feel like you can see that in St. Patrick.
And I think also St. Patrick, something he kind of witnesses in his ministry is that the gospel has always been countercultural.
Yeah.
Like, we think about it now as, you know, it's so against the culture, and it is. Obviously, we have unique challenges to our own age, but it's not like any missionary ever walked into a mission territory that was like, oh yeah, this is exactly what we were looking for. We totally understand. This makes perfect sense. Of course, we believe all people feel the call from God, and so there is always a kind of natural appeal of the gospel. But the gospel is hard. Yeah, and Patrick already is complaining about the apostate Picts, who is like a group in Scotland. And so to think that there's already been a group evangelized and who have, like, reverted by the 5th century when he is in Ireland. And part of it talks about apostasy, which was one of the major sins of the early church.
Can you define apostasy for us?
Apostasy is renouncing the faith.
Okay.
So because, like, when times got hard, people went back to their old gods, right? It's like, oh, well, my daughter's sick and the Christian God's not healing her.
She's not getting better.
So I'm going to sacrifice some cows to the idol I used to and see if that works.
It's so easy to revert back. I mean, this is the story of Israel being like, I'd rather go back to Egypt. I know it was tough, but this is worse. Like, take me back. Yeah. And we do that in our own lives. It's good to pay attention to. So, okay, I have 2 questions.
Okay.
First one, the snakes. So, there is often associated with St. Patrick that he drove the snakes out of Ireland. What do we have to say about such a thing?
So the stories about Patrick driving the snakes out of Ireland is until, like, the 8th century. So
8th?
Yeah, so 200 years after Patrick's death. And also, apparently, there are evidence of people noticing the lack of snakes in, like, the 3rd century. So the likelihood of Patrick having been responsible for driving the snakes out of Ireland is not very high. Although
you're ruining all of those that are Irish that are listening. They're like, no.
Although I do think it is a kind of, like, it's a really beautiful spiritual image if you think about, obviously, the serpent as the primordial image of the devil.
It's stuck. Yep.
And him kind of bringing this new faith against great resistance. And they would have really seen it as demonic resistance. I think it's still cool.
It's awesome. That's why it's so tragic. But it's okay. It's a good image that we can keep.
But in better news, the shamrock also probably is not St. Patrick.
I don't know if we'd call that better news. Okay, so tell us what's going on with the shamrock. Why is that associated with St. Patrick?
I don't know. I only was able to do a tiny bit of research. It seems like it's like a 17th or 18th century thing to have Patrick
real late.
With the shamrock. Yeah. And apparently the shamrock didn't have any particular special significance in Ireland before that. So I'm not sure what the deal is. I mean, Patrick clearly has a very strong Trinitarian confession at the beginning of the confession. This is the hallmark of Orthodoxy, obviously, and also still very important as Arianism, which is a rejection of Christ's divinity, is still present in nearby Gaul. So it's very important that he confess the Trinity. And he talks about preaching the triune God. And we also know that the idea of, like, trifold or triplicity was a really resonant image for sort of Irish native religion, pagan religion. And so there's no doubt that he preached the Trinity and that the Trinity was important. So it's not that it's unfitting. But, you know, I say it's good news because I'm a theologian, and the shamrock isn't, like, the best image for the Trinity.
We have to talk about that very quickly. Okay, so for any of you that don't know, Dr. Klein has written a book called What Every Catholic Should Know God. You can buy it on Catholic Market. You also did a Lexio course?
Yes.
Lexio God, that's a video course, so you don't have to read stuff. But you'll hear a little bit more about this. give us like a little bit. Why is the shamrock a bad image of the Trinity?
Because the Trinity is not divided into parts.
Okay. So if you remove one clover.
Yeah. Yeah. You can't separate. It's not just 3 parts of one thing.
Yep. Okay.
It's not like a 3-in-1. That's not exactly.
That was a teaser, but you can learn more in Lexio God and what every Catholic should know God. Okay, so just to close up here, what are some major lessons that we ourselves today, the faithful, can look at St. Patrick and maybe take into our own spiritual lives?
I think one of the main things is that the life of a Christian is that of a living sacrifice. And Patrick uses that phrase a couple times in his confession, and also a very early hymn in honor of him calls him a living sacrifice. And that can take many different forms. And, I think if we pay attention to our own lives, we will see little ways in which we're being conformed to Christ.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe even literally, you have like him not just taking the form of a slave, but Patrick actually is literally a slave.
Yeah.
And that isn't kind of lost on him, that his conversion is through this experience of slavery. And so I think that's a really important lesson, and to remember that has kind of always been the case. The way of the cross has always been the way to Christ.
It is, yeah.
Whether, yesterday, today, forever.
That is great, to make ourselves a living sacrifice. So thank you, Dr. Klein, for
Thanks
all
for
of your
having me.
wisdom. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. We will see you next time on Catholic Saints.